Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining today's Irregular Warfare Initiative virtual conference. My name is Andy Marr, the Engagements Director for IWI, and I'm your host for today's discussion about proxy warfare. I'm joined today by Shauna Sinnott, the Executive Director of IWI.
Thanks, Andy, and thanks to our panelists, moderators, and listeners for contributing to today's conversation. The Irregular Warfare Initiative is proud to bring these discussions to the IW community, especially to those of you who are practitioners, researchers, or policymakers dealing with the complexities of today's IW landscape every day. For those unfamiliar with IWI, our mission is to bridge the gap between scholars and practitioners through events such as this, but also through our podcast, editorial content, and our non-resident fellows program. We are a team of about 40 volunteers from all different professional backgrounds who are passionate about the future of irregular warfare and putting research and solutions into the field. For this event, the team members I'd especially like to acknowledge are Don Gomez, our Deputy Director of Communications, and of course our Engagements Director, Andy Marr, right here, both of whom represent many other team members who contributed to this effort. Today, we're also thrilled to partner with the Combating Terrorism Center at West Point, and in particular with Assistant Professor Don Rassler, who we want to publicly thank for helping to bring this event together.
Our panels reflect this mission of bringing together scholars and practitioners to afford you the best insight into the challenges of proxy warfare. You'll be guided through these discussions by two experts in the field. The first, Dr. Sarah Planner, is an employee of the US Department of Defense and received her PhD in political science from MIT. Previously, her position in government had involved a fellowship at World Perry House at the University of Pennsylvania and the Belfer Center at Harvard Kennedy School, where she researched the cause, conduct, and consequences of proxy warfare.
Our second panel moderator will be Dr. Nakisa Jahanbani, who is an assistant professor at West Point's Combating Terrorism Center. Her research focuses on state proxy relationships, notably Iran and its proxies, and she has a broad publishing profile in journals such as Terrorism and Political Violence and the CTC Sentinel. You will hear more about Nakisa in our second panel in due course.
I wish to now introduce our first panel today, which will explore the broad field of proxy warfare. We're honoured by Lieutenant General retired Michael Nagata, who retired in 2019 following a 38-year career in the US military, most of which was with US Special Operations, and included positions such as Special Operations Commander, Central Command, and the Director of Strategy at the National Counterterrorism Center. Our second panellist is Dr. Alexandra Stark, a senior researcher with New America, where she published the report The Monarch's Pawns in 2020, which explored proxy warfare dynamics across the Middle Eastern region. And our final panellist is Dr. Noel Anderson of the University of Toronto, whose work has examined changing trends in the external support to civil war combatants, including the rise and decline of competitive interactions or two-sided proxy wars.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you have questions for the panel, please submit comments via Twitter, which we are actively monitoring, and we will pass them to the panel. This session is also being recorded and will be available through Irregular Warfare Initiative social media following the conference. As is always the case, the views expressed today are those of the participants and do not reflect the official views of West Point, Princeton University, the Combating Terrorism Center, or any agency of the US or any other government. And now to our discussion on proxy warfare. Sarah, the microphone is yours.
Good afternoon, everyone. Big thank you to Irregular Warfare Initiative and the Combating Terrorism Center for inviting me to moderate this conversation. I'm Sarah Plana. As Andy said, I currently work for the US Department of Defense, but I'm here today in my personal capacity. The views I express today are mine alone and do not represent the views of the US government, the Department of Defense, or the administration. I'm very energized to be a part of this conversation because I've long followed and researched topics and themes related to proxy warfare. And I'm especially delighted to discuss historical trends, emerging patterns, and potential pitfalls of this form of warfare with these three experts who I've had the great fortune to learn from on several occasions. I look forward to hearing their unique vantage points and discovering unexpected commonalities, or most fun, perhaps, points of departure or debate. So first, a broad question for all of our experts. the concept of proxy warfare is at the very least contested, or and at the worst poorly understood. So how do you define the term? From your perspective, what features distinguish proxy warfare from other forms of warfare? Let's start with Alexandra.
Thanks so much, Sarah, and to IWI for including me in this conversation. I'm really excited to hear what folks have to say about this interesting set of questions. So Sarah, I think you started with a really interesting question, and one that is actually more complicated than it seems on its face. So I think scholars might define, might have slightly different definitions of proxy wars, but in general have kind of converged on an empirical definition. So Vladimir Rauta, for example, defines proxy war as, this is a paraphrase, by the way, of his definition, but a kind of intervention with an external actor that's providing indirect support. And I'll let the other two panelists say more about this kind of empirical scholarly definition of proxy war. One thing that I think is problematic or interesting is that different people, policymakers, journalists, analysts, can use the term proxy war to mean different things. So in addition to a more kind of empirical definition, there are also definitions that can be much more normative. So I took a look at how Trump and Obama administration officials use the term proxy war just to kind of better understand these differences and to compare them. And I found that Trump administration officials had typically used the term proxy wars in almost a pejorative way, and often directed specifically at Iran or sometimes at Russia. But proxy wars is typically used by those officials to describe Iran's activities, to call Iran's malign activities in the region or their destabilizing behavior, often used in tandem with claims that Iran is using funding that's derived from sanctions relief to quote unquote fuel proxy wars. And I found that in contrast, the Obama administration tended to use the term proxy war to describe a civil war that engaged third-party sponsors. But the term was often used to describe a conflict between two external powers, maybe two great powers or regional powers, who were fighting one another via proxy sponsorship. And I think all of these different distinctions they might sound a little arcane, but I think they're really important because they put a normative valence on a conversation that scholars tend to think of as largely empirical. But the different ways that the term is used by actors, including policymakers, can affect kind of their framing and how they see these conflicts empirically. So we need to be a lot more precise about what we mean when we say proxy wars.
Mike, does Alex's breakdown of the empirical definition resonate with you, and also her breakdown of, or her interpretation of how policymakers view the concept? Does that jibe with your experience?
In large measure, it does. Although she's obviously capable of giving a far more sophisticated description of what this is than you're likely to hear from me. But yes, I do agree with the way she's characterized it. I'd like to tell you what I think proxy warfare is, if you like. Yeah. Okay, I think I'll be brief about this because I know we have other things to talk about. First of all, I think proxy warfare is one of the most common and popular forms of warfare in the history of mankind. There are lots of countries that believe that they don't engage in that, but I can't think of a single powerful country that has achieved that power without somewhere in its history engaging in some form of proxy warfare. And I would include the United States in that. And the reason I think it is so commonplace, including today, is because historically, it has always been a useful and convenient tool for enabling a government, any government, when they believe that violence is required to achieve their goals or protect their interest, to hire someone that essentially constitutes the benefit of someone else doing their bleeding, their fighting, and their dying for them. And that makes it attractive. It may sound distasteful, and often it is distasteful, but it's very convenient, and therefore it is very popular, and I believe it will remain popular for the foreseeable future.
Noel, do you feel that these definitions basically map onto every way that you've seen the term used, or is there something that we're missing?
Well, I think this is a fantastic question to frame our larger discussion today, because so many conflicts have been labeled proxy wars by pundits and politicians and political scientists alike. But surprisingly, until recently, little theoretical work has really been done to identify what the defining properties of this form of conflict actually are. And an important consequence of this omission has been the conceptual stretching of this proxy war concept to a myriad of often decidedly dissimilar cases. So, the term has been used to describe conflicts where one or more minor states fight at the behest of a great power. This application of the concept was common during the Cold War, when scholars sought to interpret the role of the United States and the Soviet Union in regional conflicts, such as the Arab-Israeli or the Indo-Pakistani wars. But second, the proxy war concept has been used as a label for conflicts in which a non-state actor, so a rebel group, fights a state opponent at the behest of another state patron. And this application of the concept has become much more common in the post-Cold War period. And then a third way that this concept has been employed is as a reference to cases in which really any type of external party has indirectly engaged any type of actor in a conflict to affect its outcome. And so here we might think about private military contractors or even computer hacking groups. And then one additional wrinkle to add on top of all this concerns the distinction between one-sided support, in which only one side of a foreign conflict is receiving external aid, and two-sided support, in which both sides of a foreign conflict are receiving external aid from different third-party states. But in general, what I think unites all of these conceptualizations is three basic elements. So first, we have principals or patrons, which are provisioning external support of some kind, funding or training or arms. Second, we have agents or clients that are recipients of that external aid. And then third, we have targets, be they state or non-state actors. And then operationally, proxy wars entail principals distributing military aid in order to encourage or compel their agents to suppress or to coerce their targets. And in this sense, what I think is the distinguishing feature of proxy wars is the delegation of warfare by principals to clients against targets.
I think all of those answers give us so much to, I think, dive into. But Noel, you started off by giving us a little bit of the sense of historical trends of this form of warfare, and I wanted to dive into that a little bit more. So how should we, as policymakers, as scholars, think about the patterns of this form of warfare, especially how it may have differed from what a lot of folks think of as Cold War era proxy wars and today and into the future?
Well, with respect to frequency, how frequent are proxy wars? In fact, the vast majority of civil wars, roughly 3/4, have attracted external support of some kind between 1946 and 2009. So that's to say that throughout time, most civil wars have been and continue to be subject to proxy dynamics. And so I think General Nagata's comments are exactly on point. This is extremely common in the international system. And I'd emphasize here too that while there is yearly variation and somewhat lower rates in the early 1950s and somewhat higher rates during the 1960s and early 1970s, the prevalence of intervention has been consistently high over time. So interestingly, there's no statistically significant difference between rates of intervention during the Cold War and in the post-Cold War period, which is a surprising finding in light of conventional accounts that suggest that the end of the Cold War put a premium on domestic sources of warfighting capacity for domestic combatants. So the frequency of intervention, the percentage of conflicts attracting external support each year has not meaningfully changed over time. But what has changed, and perhaps we can get into this in more detail when we think about differences between the Cold War and post-Cold War periods, is the configuration of external aid flows. So during the Cold War, two-sided interventions were much more common, but in the post-Cold War period, one-sided interventions are more common.
Do we have a sense yet of why that is? Or, I'll let anyone else also jump in on historical patterns and how you think about the difference between the Cold War and today, or if that frame is even useful in thinking about historical trends and patterns, to General Nagata and Noel's point about the fact that prevalence has generally stayed fairly high over time.
Sarah, I'll add my own perspective on one facet of what you're asking. I said before that it's very common. I think it's becoming more common. I think it's happening more and more frequently. There are several reasons for this in my view, but I think perhaps the single most important one is that as barriers to entry to increasingly powerful technologies are literally falling everywhere around the world, they're becoming more affordable and more powerful simultaneously. This enables any proxy to begin displaying capabilities that are coming to rival what a well-endowed nation state can do. And that reality that proxies are no longer a limited, somewhat backward, not necessarily all that capable fighting force, that reality is changing very, very rapidly, because anyone can find a technology or the training and education necessary to use that technology at very low cost, actually at decreasingly, increasingly attractive prices everywhere around the world. And if I'm right that it will always be attractive for any government to have somebody else do their fighting for them, as they become more capable of doing that fighting even better and better because barriers to entry to technology are falling, it will become more common. I think it is inevitable.
Do we also think that this very good point about barriers of entry to military-related technologies decreasing, is that also having effects? Sir, you alluded to the effects on the agents, but what about effects on interveners? Do we think that this is having particular effects on frequency in that vein as well?
It takes one particular problem that always exists for any nation that hires a proxy to do their fighting for them. Assuming they succeed and the government achieves whatever goal they wanted to achieve by enlisting a proxy, now you have this very successful, very powerful fighting force. What do you do with them? How do you ensure that in the future they do not become something you regret creating? The addition of these increasingly powerful technologies makes that problem of what happens afterward even more acute.
And Sarah, if I could just jump in, I think I do think this historical framing is really useful, and the comparative framing is useful because, as Noel and Mike pointed out, their proxy wars have in some ways been consistent over time, that we've seen them consistently happening across time. But I think when you look to aspects of the conduct of proxy wars, or how they start, how they end, these aspects of technology that you were touching on, you can see a lot of differences across time. So I like to break the post-World War II period into three rough categories. There are different ways to do this. I think about it as the Cold War period, and then kind of the immediate post-Cold War period, and then what I usually refer to as the global war on terror period, beginning in about 2001 or 2002, but that really also encompasses the Arab Spring and kind of the post-Arab Spring conflicts that we saw across the region. Obviously, proxy wars are distinct by context, that each one is different in its own way. On the ground, dynamics shape a lot about everything from the beginning and the conduct to the end of proxy wars. But I'm also interested in tracing how shifts in the international system affect these aspects as well. And we know a lot from more, I think, as Noel was saying, about kind of the Cold War period of proxy wars and from that era of scholarship. But I think we're starting to kind of uncover much more about the difference between those kind of Cold War era proxy wars and the conflicts that have occurred in the immediate post-Cold War period after 9/11, and then again, especially after the Arab Spring across the Middle East. And I think there are a few attributes of this most recent kind of decades of proxy wars that I think are worth highlighting. So First is the involvement of insurgent groups that are deemed terrorist organizations by the United States, by international organizations, and the norm of non-negotiation with terrorist groups. So Dr. Lise Howard and I have done some analysis that found that sub-state conflicts that feature or include organizations that are FTOs, designated foreign terrorist organizations, are less likely to end in negotiation than other kinds of sub-state conflicts. Second, the way that the US and the EU, if not also other parts of the international community, engage in proxy wars indirectly has also changed. So the US increasingly has tended to partner with governments in the what we call the by, with, and through style missions to counter terrorist groups. So in US policy, we don't necessarily think of those as proxy wars. We don't call counterterrorism conflicts proxy wars ourselves. But I think if we look at the academic definitions or the more kind of empirical definitions of proxy war, we would find that they are, or they do fit into that category. And the third thing is that this counterterrorism approach has also permeated multilateral institutions, especially UN peacekeeping. So again, UN peacekeeping is not an institution that we typically associate with proxy wars or think of as intervening, but peacekeeping missions are increasingly taking on this characteristic. Dr. Anjali Dayal has written about how, in contrast with more maybe traditional peacekeeping missions, more recent missions are increasingly evoking the language of stabilization and counterinsurgency, and the Security Council is even giving missions the authorization to engage directly in conflict against specific armed actors, often non-state actors. So again, not something we might traditionally think of as a proxy war, but I think fits into that definition. So those are a few of the trends that I see distinguishing the current period of proxy wars from the Cold War period.
Great. Noel, do you have anything to add in terms of other factors that we might be missing? We've spoken about the low barrier to entry of technology, norms, and other international system factors. Anything else that has, is behind the changing causes or outcomes of these kinds of wars?
Yeah, I would say that the data largely supports what Alex is saying. So two-sided interventions, competitive interventions, they're more common during the Cold War. And in the post-Cold War period, we've seen a configuration of external support where it's really moved towards one-sided interventions. The prevalence of competitive intervention has actually nearly been cut in half in the contemporary period. This is, of course, a function of US-Soviet proxy wars coming to an end with the end of the Soviet Union. But it's a trend that has also been driven by significant reduction in two-sided proxy wars by weaker states as well. So the rates of which weaker states are engaging in competitive intervention has declined by about 1/3. But as I mentioned, intervention has been persistent over time. And that's because in the place of competitive intervention, we've seen a significant rise in one-sided interventions since 1990. Now, this trend can be seen throughout the post-Cold War period, but in light of what Alex just said, it really takes off after 9/11 and after the terrorist attacks and the onset of the US global war on terror, when we see a large increase in one-sided and generally US provision support. And also, as Alex indicates, that aid is tending to go towards governments and not to rebel groups or insurgent groups, terrorist groups. So the persistence in the frequency of intervention masks important variation in the configuration of external aid flows. While two-sided or competitive interventions were more common during the Cold War, this configuration of aid has been replaced to a significant degree by one-sided intervention, and it's governments that have been the primary beneficiaries of these changing trends.
Okay. Well, now that we have this overarching set of trends to situate, so we've talked about the concept, now we've talked about the trends, and the dynamics within proxy wars themselves, how they're conducted, how they play out, can be just as complex and multidimensional as what we've all been discussing so far. even just taking the multidimensional relationships between intervening states and the so-called proxies they support, I wanted to unpack that a little bit more. The term proxy even implies, as we've alluded to already, a level of power or leverage between the intervener, let's say the provider of military aid, and the actor itself. So how, if ever, are interveners or providers of military aid able to actually influence their proxies? What sorts of trade-offs do state sponsors experience in their relationships with proxies?
Sarah, I'll take the first whack at that. And as I was listening to my two colleagues, it occurred to me that I'd have to actually get a piece of paper and try to write down how many times I've been involved in trying to raise, train, equip, and employ a foreign force for the purpose of advancing a U.S. interest. I'd like to believe it was advancing their interests at the same time, but what we probably wouldn't have gone, and I probably wouldn't have been there had it not been primarily an effort to protect or advance a U.S. interest, at least over a dozen times in my career, maybe more. But getting back to your question, I've already mentioned I guess I'd almost call it an imponderable of, as a general rule, I've almost never seen any country, including my own, think through, when assuming this works, when it's all over, what happens to the proxy force? I can think of a couple of times we've managed to create a reasonably soft landing, but several times it was, it resulted in, oh my God, that's not how we thought this would end. But I think even more importantly, I alluded to how, at least in my view, proxy forces are going to be increasingly empowered by the availability of more and more powerful technology. One of the changes that is happening is that technology does not have to come from the patron. With increasing frequency, I believe proxies are going to be able to acquire much of their military intelligence, mobility, communications, and et cetera capabilities on their own, which will probably reduce the leverage that a nation state has on ensuring that as they do whatever it is the nation states wants them to do, that the nation that is sponsoring them, their patron, is going to be able to control them as well as they would like to, because these proxy groups are going to become less and less dependent on much of what we have traditionally had to provide to a proxy. They'll still be dependent on us to a degree, but they're going to be much less dependent on us in the future.
Sarah, I really like this question because I think it gets at exactly like you were saying the start of our conversation about how different definitions and conceptions of proxy war. And I think this is one that you see often in popular media, maybe, or journalism more than in academic scholarship or analysis. But there's often this proxy war. The term itself kind of conjures this idea of sponsors as these kind of grand manipulators of proxies on the ground, that they're, creating and controlling these forces for their own purposes, which sometimes is true, but often I think it's more complicated in practice than that kind of conception of what a proxy war is. And that the relationships between sponsors and proxies is a lot more complicated. And in fact, Sarah, your own research has really highlighted that. In studying regional intervention in the Middle East, I've come to see or think about some proxy sponsor relationships, not just to complicate things a bit more, not just as a bilateral relationship between a sponsor and a proxy, but more like a chain where regional states can both be proxies and sponsors of proxies. So regional actors, regional states can support and cultivate their own proxies on the ground. And that can range from kind of indigenous groups that they've basically adopted or are providing support to, but basically have their own agendas, to organizations where sponsors have played a much more significant role in their kind of creation and formation and training. And in many cases, these states will also intervene directly themselves, sometimes to support their proxy groups, for example, maybe by providing close air support or on the ground capacity building, but also maybe in pursuit of their own interests. But at the same time, these regional actors also have their own relationships with other states and with great powers in particular. And these relationships, I see these relationships between regional states and great powers as not unlike proxy sponsor relationships, in the sense that they're also trying to kind of navigate what they see as their own interests, as well as for example, what the United States wants, or what Russia or the Soviet Union or their kind of great power sponsor wants, when that power is an important source of weapons, training, maybe logistical support. And what I've found in my research is that when a great power like the US tries to use leverage that it has over a regional actor, it can significantly shape how that actor itself intervenes, and also its relationship with proxy groups.
So I would just add to this question, especially about power or leverage and how sponsors are able to influence their proxies. I think there certainly is asymmetry of power between the patron and the client. But that said, there's also a common bond that sustains the two sides, which is a shared strategic interest in mutual collaboration. So these relationships endure because both sides believe that they're advancing their self-interest. And then cooperation can be sustained through side payments or maybe coercive leverage. And then at times, other factors such as shared ethnicity or a common ideology can serve to strengthen the ties that bind proxies to sponsors. But yes, I think that there are, of course, also trade-offs for state patrons. So the act of delegating war to a proxy creates problems because the alignment of interests between the patron and the client are never exactly perfect, which is to say that there's always some degree of interest asymmetry. Principals can try to overcome this interest asymmetry problem through conditionality or other forms of reward or punishment, but conditionality is challenged due to a second problem, which is information asymmetries, which is the fact that agents typically know more about their own circumstances and their own level of effort than the principal does. And so at root, while states support proxies to forgo some of the direct costs of conflict, they also lose some level of foreign policy autonomy. And for this reason, delegation inevitably produces imperfect performance, at least to some degree. Sometimes not much, sometimes a lot. And at its worst, this problem, which is generally known as agency slack, it can entail the agent taking actions that are not consistent with the preferences of the principal, which in turn can lead to escalation or blowback or other types of strategic problems that the principal would otherwise like to avoid.
We've gotten some questions about applying this to cases. And this framework, I think we've talked a lot about a bunch of different factors that may factor into the ability of a sponsor to leverage its military aid dependencies and factors that feed into dependencies, shared interests or strategic interests, shared bonds of some sort. Are there particular cases where you've seen maybe General Nagata, from your own experience, about the factors that in practice were the most successful in, control, as we say, as to Alex's point earlier about the sort of often pejorative nature of some of these terms that we use, control or managing of the relationship between a sponsor and a recipient. How have you navigated it in practice?
Uncertainly is how I've navigated, I think, is the best answer. I scored some wins and scored some losses in doing it. One rather irresistible example that I think is worth exploring just for a moment is the various efforts the United States and an international coalition against ISIS tried to do regarding, we didn't use this term, but I'll use it because it's the right term. The work that was done to create a proxy force in Syria to combat the Islamic State. I think most people know that the initial effort was to find Syrian Arabs that would create a fighting force that could, at our behest, close with and destroy those portions of the Islamic State that were on the western side of the Syria-Iraq border. That ran into a lot of problems. It really struggled, mostly because I was the commander at the time, but regardless, we had unbelievable problems with that. And the fundamental difficulty we struggled to overcome was that if you ask the average Syrian citizen, who do you hate more? Do you hate the Islamic State or do you hate the Assad regime? 100% of the time, they hated the Assad regime, at least in the parts of Syria that we were trying to recruit from. So there was a disconnect between what they cared about and what we wanted them to care about. We did eventually raise thousands of Arabs to fight on the coalition's behalf, but it in my judgment, it worked because of a different effort we mounted that actually succeeded, and that was getting the Syrian Kurds to create an effective fighting force against the Islamic State. Very different from the Syrian Arabs. If you asked a Kurd up in northeastern Syria, who do you hate more, the Islamic State or the Assad regime? They always said the Islamic State, because the Assad regime was virtually no threat whatsoever to the Kurdish population. The Syrian government was trying to stay away from conflict with the Kurds. So it was 1,000 times easier to raise a fighting force out of the Syrian Kurds. What was interesting to watch was, as that started to succeed, and we literally had thousands of Kurdish fighters flocking to the coalition's banner, rather paradoxically, many of the Syrian elements that had previously given us the Heisman started saying, hey, I want in on this. And I think they did because they realized, oh, this is actually going to succeed, and I want to be part of a success.
I think what you're getting at as well is this, maybe, if I may, like an asymmetry of interest or preference misalignment, to the point earlier that you made, that it's easier maybe to think about control if there's actually no control to be had, that there is, you're requesting, and then there is a natural inclination to do the bidding. Were there other examples that you all in your research and your experience have seen where, and I know we spoke a little bit about the Sunni Arab Train and Equip program in Syria, are there other examples where, in cases of preference misalignment, when it was the hardest cases of control, where there was some form of the ability for a state sponsor to actually control or to manage the relationship in a productive manner for their own purposes, productive for their own purpose anyway?
Yeah, I look at the war in Yemen, or kind of the overlapping wars in Yemen, as an example at multiple levels of where you see these kinds of misalignments. So at maybe the higher level, you have the United States providing logistical support to the Saudi-led coalition that began intervening in the conflict in 2015. And a lot of tension between US policymakers and the coalition about airstrikes that were killing a lot of Yemeni civilians and what to do about that. And tension that eventually led to a pretty significant shift in domestic politics in the United States, and in even kind of a souring of the relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia over this issue of how should this intervention be conducted, should it even be happening at all. And then kind of to move down a level, the coalition itself is supporting multiple insurgent groups of military forces within Yemen, many of whom are aligned broadly against the Houthis, but also have divergent interests of their own. And that can significantly diverge from what the coalition might want. So, for example, there are Southern militias or Southern military groups whose ultimate aim is secession, is Southern Yemen secession from the rest of the state, which is not necessarily what the coalition is interested in, or what other even groups in that broad coalition are interested in. And so I think you often see kind of a short-term trade-off where it seems like interests are relatively aligned in the short term, but that can become more problematic over the long term as those differences really come out and the divergence starts to happen.
And I'll just add, on this same theme, but from a different angle, these sponsor proxy relationships can be sustained for a long time, sometimes with really interesting partners. History is replete with examples of sustained partnerships between decidedly strange bedfellows. So consider US support for the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, or more interestingly, the alliance between apartheid South Africa and UNITA in Angola. In both cases, I think the taproot of sustained partnership was the belief held by both sides that collaboration was beneficial for strategic self-interested ends. And that's common to proxy sponsor relationships that endure, that congruence in strategic interest.
In some actually separate research that I've done, I found that I think the longest running, correct me if I'm wrong, Noel, relationship that the US had was allegedly with the Tibetans, actually, in the 50s and 60s, around 18 years. So these relationships can go for a very, very long time for various different reasons. And I think one trend that we didn't get to, but would be interesting for future research and practitioners to look into, is why they last, what the difference in duration is, and why we get some shorter forms of this sort of relationship and much longer, up to 18 years perhaps in other cases. So I wanted to also ask, given that we've also sort of started the conversation about the different forms of actors, and just ask you to reflect on whether the form of actor in whatever case or whatever factor you want to look into, but for example, if the actor itself is a state versus a non-state, if the actor has secessionist goals, or is like ethno-nationalist, or other factors, basically the feature of the recipient of the aid, if that matters in terms of managing the relationship, if certain forms that the recipient of aid takes matters for control, for questions of control.
I'll take a whack at that as well. It absolutely matters. I've often seen there be a bit of a debate in our own government, for example, when we are contemplating trying to enlist some sort of partner, a proxy, even though you can't say that in the kinds of meetings I used to go to, but that's a proxy we're talking about. About what does it take? What does it take to get this group that we're considering having a relationship with, to get them to do what we want them to do? And often the debate would move into the arena of, can we just give them stuff and not have to actually send anybody there or get into some sort of potentially unsavory relationship? Or can we just give them stuff and, for the right price, they do whatever we want them to do? It's not an irrational question. It's just, I think any practitioner of this art form knows full well that if all you do is give stuff to a potential proxy so that they hopefully do what you want them to do, it can be money, it can be guns, it can be almost anything, you only have a transactional relationship. And transactional relationships are inherently fragile. Transactional relationships only endure so long as the transaction is perceived as a benefit to whoever your proxy is. The moment they realize, they believe they're no longer getting a benefit from the relationship, they'll walk away from the relationship. in many cases, the problem we were trying to solve was incredibly complex, incredibly difficult, incredibly dangerous. And any practitioner looking at this would realize almost immediately that, okay, a transactional relationship with this proxy is never going to get us there. They're never going to take the risks. They're never going to put themselves in the kind of danger. They're never going to be willing to exert themselves as much as we need them to accomplish these goals. So we actually have to have more than just a transactional relationship. But here's the rub, and I'll stop. That requires sending Americans to go work with, live with, and stay with these partners. Not because we don't trust them, but because if we don't demonstrate that we've got skin in the game, they will always treat this as a shallow transactional relationship.
Thank you for that. So I guess we'll transition a little bit. I'm curious, a common refrain in scholarship and commentary on proxy war, and in fact, I think we've even hit upon it already in conversation, is that this by, with, and through strategy is a low-cost strategy of warfare. But as Ukraine has shown, and sort of previewing maybe the conversation that will follow us here, it does not come without its own risks for both the intervener and the partner proxy, what term you want to use. So how have we seen, or how should we understand the costs and risks of proxy warfare to both of these actors? And then if I could also ask, how do we think about the broader costs and consequences of this form of warfare to other actors, maybe those in the conflict themselves, civilians, or even other audiences?
Yeah, I think to take an example, in the Middle East, especially in the wake of the Arab Spring and the subsequent conflicts there, you kind of saw this dynamic where in the short term for regional actors like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, and others, they saw intervening in these conflicts as a real opportunity to kind of expand their regional influence, but quickly realized that what actually happened was that they became involved in this series of quagmires that drained resources, but also destabilized these countries where they were trying to install friendlier governments. And there's a similar kind of dynamic, I think, for other external interveners, great powers specifically, where their interests are more often about kind of regional stability rather than the outcome of a specific conflict. But the deepening and the continuation of these conflicts is really a problem in terms of stability. So I think often interveners maybe don't take into account these effects of proxy wars and intervention in terms of civilian harm and casualties, in terms of polarizing societies, and in terms of destroying economies, and the long-term efforts that are really necessary to rebuild societies in the wake of proxy wars. And often avoiding the wars in the first place is the best way to avoid those negative consequences.
Yeah, I would add to this. Proxy wars have serious negative effects for the societies that they afflict. We know that proxy wars prolong conflict. In my own research, this is what I show, in particular for competitive intervention, decreases the hazard of a conflict terminating by over 50% across every point in time during a conflict episode. So this is a really substantively large effect. And given that the costs imposed by conflicts are a function of their duration, how long they last, the implications for stability and human security are really significant. First, the number of deaths inflicted by a conflict increase as it endures. So the total number of deaths inflicted will go up. Second, the intensity of violence. So the conflict's daily death rate is likewise higher in longer wars. So it's not just we have more dead in total, we have higher rates of violence. And then added to all of this is the brutality of the long-term economic costs imposed on suffering societies, higher military expenditure, capital flight, declining, if not reversing, economic growth. And all of these effects have been shown to persist for years after fighting has come to an end, which is a direct consequence of the deterioration, if not the total ruin, of a society's economic and political and social institutions. And really, this only scratches the surface, because there's civilian victimization, there's mass population displacement, and everyday lives just being ruined. So proxy wars are often thought of as being less costly for states that engage in them, at least relative to direct confrontation. But we should make no mistake about the fact that proxy war is still war, and the costs for suffering societies are often horrific.
I would also challenge and say there are also probably costs for the interveners as well. So should we think, or how should we think about the costs and risks? I'm thinking especially escalation risks, but there are also potentially other forms of risk that state sponsors take on when they decide to pursue this form of strategy.
Sarah, you're touching one of my hot buttons here. I'll just confine my commentary to the government I know best, which is my own government. We are not good at anticipating what the consequences of choosing to engage in proxy warfare actually are. And I'm not suggesting that it's necessarily or inherently unwise. There are some efforts I've been involved in raising a foreign force and effectively employing that I'm very proud of, that I'm very glad we did. And we managed, however imperfectly, to ensure that we didn't have so many unintended consequences afterwards that we regretted doing it. But that said, as a government, we do a poor job of thinking through what are the first, second, third order effects of doing what we are contemplating doing, raising, training, equipping, and employing an effective fighting force, primarily because it meets our own needs and advances our own interests. Again, not illegitimate, it's just, that's what we do. But because I don't want to go on endlessly here, my principal diagnosis is there is a tendency, the higher you go up the leadership ladder of the United States government, the more and more wishful thinking you encounter about what are the consequences of engaging in proxy warfare. This is nasty, brutish business at its best, even if wildly successful. It's nasty, brutish business for all the reasons Noel and Alex have been talking about, has consequences that will last for a generation. And when we are short-sighted or just lazy in thinking through what are the consequences of engaging in proxy warfare, we always live to regret it.
I think that's very strong and poignant point, sir. So this is the last question on my end. So I think something that we have sort of spoken around is what actual ends state sponsors seek through these forms of through using this particular tool, if we like to think of proxy warfare as a particular tool. So how do you think about what interveners are trying to accomplish? What sort of frameworks do you use to think about those goals? And how frequently have those goals actually come to fruition?
Well, again, I'll be brief this time. Sometimes what we do is we do what I was suggesting a moment ago. We think through the consequences of what we're doing, and we do it in such a way that we reduce the likelihood of being surprised by what happens after the fighting is over. But that's not generally what we do. What we generally do is we get surprised, and often in very bad ways, by what comes after the proxy war, and then we end up having, large scale after action reviews of, oh my God, how did this happen? Who's responsible for this? And sometimes in those meetings, I wanted to hand mirrors around, say, take a look in the mirror.
In terms of the consequences for sponsors too, I think it's one thing that we see is that there aren't just strategic consequences, but also kind of broader consequences as well that are often really unanticipated, and that you might not even necessarily think of in those meetings and conversations prior to sponsoring a proxy group. So turning again to Yemen, for example, I think the regional intervening states, the Saudi-led coalition, certainly doesn't seem that they realized at the beginning of the intervention that the conduct of the intervention, the humanitarian consequences and killing of civilians would have such a negative, repercussions for their international reputations and for their bilateral relationships with the United States and with the EU and with other important security partners. And so I think it's really important not just to, as Mike was saying, just to take the most positive view of what could happen, but to really think beyond even the immediate strategic consequences and other consequences, because there are so many potential unintended consequences or unanticipated consequences that span not just strategic aims, but broader issues as well.
Yeah, and I would just add, states use proxies for multiple ends. Often they seek to see their clients through to a battlefield victory, but sometimes interveners also seek more limited objectives. This could include preventing the defeat of a client, or bleeding the resources of a rival, or even just sowing chaos and disorder in an enemy state. But what I think unites all of these objectives is a fundamentally coercive purpose. So states use proxies to get an opponent, whether that's another state or a rebel group or a militia or whatever it may be, to do something that it does not want to do. And in that sense, when we think about the ends of state sponsorship, I tend to think of them as coercive ends that states are pursuing when they engage in these kinds of relationships.
I think just one more, I'll sneak another one in, but it's related, which is, are there particular cases that you think in mind? We've talked a lot about the costs and the negative consequences of this form of warfare. Are there cases that you think are catastrophic and cases that actually were not catastrophic in whatever definition you take of that? Catastrophic strategically for the state sponsor, or not catastrophic strategically for the state sponsor, or actually had positive effects for civilians or the proxies themselves, or very negative effects?
Oh gosh, the catastrophic examples are too numerous to mention.
So maybe the successful ones are the better examples.
Okay, well, I'll just, yeah, I've been so negative, I should end on a high note. I mean, the government involved would certainly object to me using the word proxy for the story that I'm about to tell. But US Special Operations Forces raised, trained, equipped, and employed the single most effective special operations force in the Middle East, and that is Iraqi SOF. Hands down, without exception, they are the best in the business in the Middle East. And we fought alongside them first after the intervention in Iraq. We fought with them side by side with them against Al-Qaeda. And then a few years later, we did exactly the same thing against the Islamic State. Any of my colleagues that were to one degree or another involved in the raising, the training, equipping, and advising them and going with them into combat should be incredibly proud of how professional, how effective, how cohesive, and how impressive that fighting force is. They're not perfect, no force is, but they're amazingly good when you look at their peer competitors around the region. There's nobody that can touch them, except, of course, the Israelis. But in the Arab world, nobody can touch them. We should be very proud of that. There are lessons to be learned from that. One of them being we never lost contact with them. One way or the other, even after the withdrawal in 2011, we never lost contact with them. And that paid huge dividends 4 years later when we had to go surging back into Iraq because of the emergence of the Islamic State. I wish I could tell you what I just described was my common experience over all the years I did this, but unfortunately, I consider it a one-off.
Are there other examples of relationships with so-called proxies that have worked in the favor of the state sponsor?
It's a very challenging question. I think there's like a normative component to it, which makes it hard. I think many states would argue that these proxy relationships were successes in one way or another, even if someone else might say that it was a failure. So it is very challenging to think of. I think if there's one thing I would say, and this really does kind of touch on General Nagata's point, is it seems like assistance to special forces tends to be more efficient. Standing up special forces units tends to be more successful. That's not particularly systematic. That's just something I've begun to notice, but that would probably be one area that I would point to.
Alex, you have the last word.
Well, I was sort of thinking that also speaks to questions of security assistance more broadly, and when is security assistance successful or not successful? And again, depending on what you define as a proxy war, and is arming and working with a security partner, a state partner, is that a proxy war or not? But just to take one example, I know the next panel is going to get much deeper on Ukraine and Russia, but to look at U.S. security assistance to Ukraine in 2014, and how the quality of Ukrainian forces had kind of evolved since then, what has changed, and to what extent can we attribute that to security assistance or to other factors, I think kind of speaks to this question of how you think about success and successful relationships.
And what we mean by success already has come up to be very important to define. Success for whom, in what time period, and to what end. So thank you all for a really stimulating discussion. I've learned quite a bit from you all. I'll continue to think about the short-term prioritization of short-term interest, long-term interest, effects on the proxy now, effect on civilian now versus effects on the regional stability or those actors later, and second order and third order effects. I'll also be thinking about how this so-called low-cost form of warfare is not always as low cost or is not zero cost for various different actors who are affected by this form of warfare. And also I'll be thinking a lot about uncertainty about anticipating the effects of using this form of tool, and also uncertainty about the ability to actually manage the relationship in both directions by the intervener and also by the proxy themselves. So thank you all. Thank you to EWE and CTC again. And I officially return and relinquish the virtual microphone back to Andy.
Ladies and gentlemen, with Sarah's closing comments, I wish to thank our first panel for their insight and for their support to the Irregular Warfare Initiative in making this event happen. For our audience, now's your opportunity for a comfort break or perhaps to top up your glass as we prepare for our second panel discussion, which will now look at the proxy warfare dynamics specific to the Russia-Ukraine conflict.
At this point, I'd like to reintroduce our moderator for the second panel discussion, Dr. Nakisa Jahanbani. As I mentioned earlier, Nakisa is an assistant professor at West Point's Combating Terrorism Center. Her research focuses on state proxy relationships, notably Iran and its proxies, and she has a broad publishing profile in journals such as Terrorism and Political Violence and the CTC Sentinel. Our first panelist is Colonel Brian Groves, PhD, Chief of the Commander's Initiative Group for U.S. Army Forces Command. He's previously led the National Military Strategy Development and worked at the Combating Terrorism Center. Our second panelist is Dr. Kasper Reykjavik, who joins us this evening from Norway, where he is a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Research on Extremism at the University of Oslo. He formerly worked at the Polish Institute of International Affairs. And our final panelist is Ben Dalton, who is the program manager for New America's Future Frontlines program. Ben's particular interest is in Russian and Slavic studies, buttressing work as a journalist, communications officer, and producer for several media outlets.
Ladies and gentlemen, a reminder that if you have any questions for the panel, please submit comments via Twitter. And again, a reminder that the comments that are made are the views of the participants themselves and not the views of any respective organisation. And so now to our discussion on proxy warfare in the Russia-Ukraine context. Nikisa, the microphone is yours.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. I've long been an admirer of IWI, as has everyone at CTC. So I'm just thrilled to be able to speak with each of you and learn from you. And we have a remarkable lineup of panelists today. The significance of the conflict in Ukraine is self-evident. It intersects so many issue areas that are of concern to the U.S. defense community, like great power competition, in addition to why we're here today, proxy conflict. And as the previous panel indicated in their really colorful discussion, proxy involvement in conflicts can destabilize them in a number of ways, including prolonging them, making them more violent, and all issue areas that are of growing concern in the case of this war in particular, as it enters its 8th or 9th month and has led to tens of thousands of deaths and wounded and millions of displaced people. So as I said, tonight we have a remarkable lineup for our portion of the panel of researchers and practitioners that study and touch on various aspects of proxy warfare, generally and in this conflict specifically. For the rest of the time, I'll mix questions in throughout. Some will be for the whole panel, some for specific people. In truth, they could probably all answer all of the questions. Their expertise is very wide. So even if I pose a question to one of you, I just welcome all of you to build off of each other's responses, regardless of who the question is posed to. So for some scene setting questions at first, Ben, I know you've done some work to unpack the entities involved, the Russian proxies involved in the conflict in Ukraine. Can you tell us a little bit, who are the proxy actors involved in the Russia-Ukraine war?
Yeah, sure thing. Thank you so much for having me on. As you mentioned, I'm the program manager for Future Frontlines, which is a program at New America. And a short way to describe what we do is we look at the intersection of political conflict and technology. And in this particular case, we've been focusing very heavily on the conflict in Ukraine, and in particular, looking at this organization that everybody has heard of called the Wagner Group or Wagner Group, however you prefer to pronounce it. And we look at it through their sort of online chatter. We monitor their social media feeds very closely. So taking a step back, just to sort of contextualize this a little bit. On the Russian side of this war, there's several different actors, players. In some ways, I've heard people describe it almost as like a pre-modern military. You've got mercenaries, regular soldiers. So, a couple of different broad categories. You've got regular soldiers on contract who are now increasingly being joined by conscripts. You have conscripted men from the breakaway regions themselves, LNR and DNR. And they are often seen to occupy some of the worst roles with the least training and equipment. You have Chechens under the command of Ramzan Kadyrov. And then you have this very broad category that often gets called the Wagner Group, but is really comprised of numerous volunteer and soldier of fortune contingents, some of whom have an international background, although it seems that that's far from the majority. And so taking that last group and breaking it down just like a little bit further, at the start of the war, the typical profile for the men who were in this group was a veteran of the Russian military, very often VDV, which is the air assault units, or various Spetsnaz units. There are also far-right volunteer contingents that, for example, there's a unit called Rusich. There's one that's appeared over the summer called the Margul Partizan, which is affiliated with the Russian imperial movement. There's also battalions that are sort of tied more closely to the breakaway regions, such as the Sparta Battalion. There's a handful of foreign fighter units, or at least foreign fighters, that have been reported from places like Central Asia and the Balkans, in particular Serbia. And obviously, everyone has heard since the summer of these sort of prisoner units that are being recruited from Russian prisons, who seem to be assigned just bottom of the barrel tasks like body collection, things like that. Maybe we can get into the role that we see these forces playing a little bit, but that's sort of like my broad overview of who's fighting on the Russian side.
Brian or Casper, would you like to add to any element of that?
Yes, thank you for that. Thank you for having me. Maybe quickly, because to top up, so to speak, Ben's point, we gotta understand that this way of fighting, done by Russia nowadays, it is historically sanctioned and blessed by the Russian state. You know, it has been so throughout hundreds of years. It's not because they're not modern. It's not because they're this or that. This is a non-homogeneous society, which is racially and ethnically diverse. And, you know, far-right figures in the West think it's otherwise, but that is the reality. And their, let's say, order of battle has been mixed. It's, you know, we have this perception of the Red Army being, you know, unified command and, you know, fighting from the 1940s, and it was just the Red Army. It has always, believe me, been different. And this is the reflection of that situation. You also can throw in the Chechens into that mix. You can throw in, of course, the all sorts of PMCs in there. And that is the reflection of how Russia does warfare. It's also a reflection of the fact that there are many patrons and curators of the Russian state. It's not a unitary state, really. I mean, it is and it's not. So it's not that Vladimir Putin controls it all. So please do remember that this is also the reflection of the internal, let's say, rivalries, internal fights that are actually taking place in Moscow. And this is a natural state of affairs. It hurts them, it harms them, thankfully, for us. Let's be honest. But this is also how they do things. And maybe the last point, there are also proxies which are non-lethal, so to speak, because Russia thinks always, and has done so always consistently, although we certainly overestimated its capacities, as being at war with us, if you like. Therefore, any entirety which can be weaponized to hurt us in the West is essentially an element of its forces. So a far-right political party that is sponsored, a far-left political party that is sponsored by Russia or somehow controlled, it is actually an element of its order of battle. So please do consider that it's not just the ones who are pulling the trigger, it's also other elements, which in 2014 have been fantastically visible out there on the front. Not so much now, because the logistics of actually getting to Russia is complicated. You know, it's kind of toxic to even touch them politically now. But back in 2014, when this was the hybrid war, that was a completely different situation. And you had these forces essentially, rowing in the same direction as Moscow. Some of their players, prominent members, traveling as, election observers to the so-called separatist territories. And let's not forget the fact that the whole war starts by proxies. Russia goes through this huge effort to dress up its own men, military men or former military men, as proxies, as local separatists, who are then basically transplanted onto the Ukrainian territory and being told, hey, you are actually a local, in a fashion, reminiscent of the 1940s, when so many Russian communists were actually being told, hey, now you're Polish, Czechoslovak, or this or that. Essentially the same process happens. So, it's a broader effort. It's been going on since 2014, but please let's not forget that this is how they roll, if I could put it, kind of in a really street slang, if you like. So my few cents at the beginning. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. I have a general question for all of you. What's your understanding of how Russia's proxy engagement has evolved over the course of the Ukrainian conflict? Are there some recent trends with regards to their support that seem the most significant to you in your research? For whoever would like to start out.
I mean, I can jump in there. So if we're talking about what commonly gets called the Wagner Group, their role has definitely changed a lot over the course of this war. I mean, when you want to say the war started in 2014, but at least as of the 2022 invasion, we saw some evidence online that some forces were actually pre-positioned within Ukraine for the purposes of reconnaissance and tagging of targets. But in the initial invasion in February and March, it seemed as though they did not play as prominent of a direct sort of battlefield role. Then, as the Russian state came to terms with the fact that it had grossly underestimated the number of bodies that it needed in this war, to occupy one of arguably the biggest country in Europe, depending on whether you want to count Greenland. They started playing a larger battlefield role. A lot of what they are tasked with is what has always been their bread and butter, which is reconnaissance, sabotage, assassinations, and sniping. A member of our team recently traveled to Kyiv and spoke with some security officers there who said that there was evidence that they were at least involved in the effort in the very first days of the war to try to assassinate President Zelensky, which obviously did not succeed. And then more recently, over the course of the summer and now into the fall, we see that not only are they fighting, that they are, in some cases, some of the most effective units on the field. Right now, there are Wagner forces who are still advancing around the town of Bakhmut when virtually every other Russian force is retreating in some capacity. And I think that's down to a combination of factors. One being that, at least, setting aside like the prisoner units that people have been talking about, these tend to be more experienced fighters, veterans. They seem to have closer lines of command to people with authority. People are actually confident making decisions. And they also seem to be better provisioned, which is related to these fundraising and sort of provisioning lines that they have set up themselves, which I'd be happy to get into later on as well, where you actually have networks of volunteers back at home who are collecting donations and buying gear and shipping it to the front line.
Casper or Brian, anything to add?
Yeah, I would definitely echo Ben's points, if I may. It's the growing role on one hand, and on the other hand, there is this Russian joke that fascism wouldn't work in Russia because nothing works in Russia. But these groups, these proxies, if you like, PMCs, call them whatever you like, they simply seem to have better and shorter supply chains. Let's put it this way, and then things can move there more quickly. And they have the political clout. Please do remember that this wouldn't be the case had it not been that they have what's Russians call the krisha, so the roof. And as long as this system works, then you can deploy such a group almost outside the command of the regular military command, and this group will look more decisive, better trained, better equipped, fighting for better money, having better morale because XYZ. It's all kind of interconnected here. And as the Russian army falters, it seems so. Obviously, thousands of individuals like that fighting in key battle spots, they'll be more noticeable and they'll be more prominent. So obviously, this is an element of to watch in that role. And I think we reached the point at which Moscow will throw anything it can into the mix. And here is a pretty deployable element, but they're not saviors, let's put it this way, and I'm sure we'll hear more about that throughout our discussion.
Casper, to follow up, I know you've done some work on Russia's use of proxies over the last few years. Based on, we've talked about some of the recent trends in support, some of the actors, would you say that Russia's proxy use in Ukraine falls in line with what it's done over the last few years in other conflict contexts, or is it different in this setting?
The problem with Russia is that it's so amorphous And it's the in the way it does business that you can always turn around and say that it's the way that this has been planned and done. And please do remember that up until February 24th, 2022, we all thought that Vladimir Putin is a master of 3D underwater chess, whereas we all play with Lego. And this is obviously a hard lesson for quite a few people in the field, and probably me, including myself. Is this a change? I would say historically, that's the way they would roll. But obviously, this was meant to be a completely different thing. Let's not forget that. The way they start off on the 24th, which someone rather wryly commented that it's to launch a few missiles and throw the paras into the mix, paratroopers, and this will be done, and Ukraine will fall. The joke from the Telegram accounts of the Russian Telegram accounts of the first day, that 8 o'clock invasion, 12 o'clock lunch, 1 o'clock parade in Kiev, suggested that this was meant to be a much smaller affair, and only later, now we see the growing trend towards reliance on the kind of non-state, because it's Russia. At the end of the day, we can be we use the word proxies, people who fight instead of us, but deep down, somewhere at the end of the chain, these are state actors. They're somehow state control. There's a curator there. They're not genuinely outside the orbit. And I think one thing to remember also is the fact that look at the propaganda element of it. That for the Russians, it's actually Ukrainians who are proxies for NATO and the US. And listen to the words of President Putin, who quite clearly says that this isn't really about Ukraine. It is about the global fight, which is partly true, partly not true, because I think, this desire to eradicate Ukraine is there. But at the same time, this is the beauty of it in a way, that it's so amorphous. It's been amorphous that on day A, it can be, eradicate Ukraine, and on day B, it can be a global crusade against LGBT. And, in such a conflict, you have to rely on seemingly bottom-up organized forces that can be deployed, more quickly, in a more offhand manner, if you like. And this will certainly continue, because it's a reflection of what this state really is, and how it has been moving, and how it has been positioning itself both internationally and at the front lines.
Wonderful. Thank you. Brian, I was wondering if I could get your 2 cents on this. Earlier, we heard General Nagata mention the raising, training, and equipping of local soft forces, and Alex discussed the U.S.'s previous security assistance to Ukraine. Would engaging in a similar engagement in the current conflict in Ukraine be useful for the U.S. and its interest in the region? Why or why not?
Sure. Thanks. I appreciate that, Nikisa. So one thing, by means of segue from what we have been talking about, I think we say that beauty is in the eye of the beholder. And I think that potentially the definition of being a proxy might be in the eye of the beholder as well. And so what I mean by that is, from our perspective, we typically think of the United States as being the one having proxies, but each of the other states involved in this conflict are operating in their own way. And likewise, the Ukrainians could arguably be seeing the United States as their proxy, because we are providing them training and security assistance. And the two of those aspects are coming together, for instance, in Germany, in the Grafenwehr training area and elsewhere, where we are doing work to help support our own interests, to answer your question, as the president has defined it, and his administration, expressing multiple times as recently as this weekend. Secretary of Defense Austin had doubled down on that and indicated we're going to be with the Ukrainian armed forces for as long as it takes, with whatever, providing them what they need. And so I think, yes, our policymakers, and they're certainly my civilian masters, and I don't speak for them, obviously, as Andy mentioned from the get-go, my views only, but it is my sense that we are operating in what we've determined to be our interest, that from our perspective, it may be seen that we're doing, as Special Forces personnel refer to, working by, with, and through the Ukrainian armed forces to accomplish those objectives through the security assistance material we're providing, along with the training on that material, in order to have effects on the battlefield, in order to accomplish the extension of politics by other means that Clausewitz talks about. And yet the Ukrainians could see that we're the ones helping them accomplish their objectives.
Before I open it up to the other panelists, Brian, I had a follow-up question. Is there a similar case of U.S. Security assistance engagement or support that mimics this conflict that you think we can draw on practically that could be useful in this setting?
So I think it's challenging because there's a number of factors that come into play as to whether proxies are effective or not. And we could certainly talk about that at some point. But I think potentially the Syrian Democratic Forces, or SDF, is an example that's fairly recent that bridges kind of this period of time where we've pivoted, if you will, from a focus primarily on the war on terrorism to focusing on large-scale combat operations, as we say in the Army, what used to be termed under the National Defense Strategy 2018 as great power competition, and is now more in the current NDS 22 terminology, yet to come out on the unclassified side, but as strategic competition. Nonetheless, whatever term you put on it, I think we can see in the SDF support example, we were fairly effective together because their capabilities were pretty significant, their will was pretty significant, the alignment of our interests or our aims and the ways we wanted to go about accomplishing those aims were fairly aligned, they're fairly close together. And in this case, I think some of those factors are also true, as well as the capacity, both in money and time, in economic support, etc., whether on the sanctions side or on the security assistance side. I think it's something like 16.9 billion that the U.S. has provided alone or pledged to provide to Ukrainian armed forces. And we have international legitimacy and support from NATO and other countries. And so I think all of those factors in both cases, the de-ISIS coalition, and then in this case as well, have led to, so far in the time horizons we've seen, pretty effective efforts, though in different regions.
Wonderful, thank you. Just to take a little bit of a backpedal, it seems like an audience member, and it might line up with this, but an audience member asked for a follow-up and expansion on Casper's historical comment about proxies from 2014 and earlier for additional perspective. Do you have anything to add? I also saw you respond kind of animatedly to Brian's comment earlier about the perspective of who's a proxy on either side. So if you want to add to that too, I would love to hear what you have.
Yes, that's the beauty of it on our side, if you like, because if Ukrainians think that we are, or NATO, US, or what have you, any country is their proxy, then obviously, we're in a way beating Russia at its game in this sense, and I'm far from being an objective observer of this conflict. I'm Polish, so you cannot expect full objectivity from me on this one. But that is very much in line that NATO says, and many Western governments and military says, we're not in this war really. And at the same time, you've got these efforts, training and stuff like that, and Ukrainians could turn around and actually be saying this, which I think is brilliant. Secondly, on the historical side, it necessitates probably a multi-volume effort, to be honest, because it is a fascinating story. Because in 2014, there is the so-called the little green man of the Russian military who take over Crimea. That's the early bit. And that's very much, blessed, state-led, and then state-operated effort. But then when things start to get wrong in Donbass in the spring of 2014, you've got all sorts of interesting interesting players appearing there. And some of them had also been present in the Crimea in the first place and are as exotic as, contingents of Serbian paramilitaries who used to be construction men in Russia and working on Sochi Olympics. Actually, they were in Russia. They were easily available and easy to be mobilized. They're all veterans of the Yugoslav wars of the 1990s, and lo and behold, they appear in Crimea. You have, as I would say, veterans of the Russian special and security services who are also allegedly as volunteers in Crimea, and lo and behold, in the spring of 2014, they appear in Donbass. It's this process that you bring in, and then there's the massive mobilization of what one could call, and what Russia insists on calling, essentially volunteers. And effectively, had this been a normal war, I mean, what a term, we would call them foreign fighters, really, that, Russian individuals who go and fight for the liberation of, inverted commas, Donetsk and Luhansk. And there is this pretense of this being a bottom-up operation, which is essentially run by the military draft offices. Yet at the same time, no, we have nothing to do with that. And all these actors appear, and for a larger period of time, up until the summer of 2014, they are the ones, so to speak, holding the line for the Russian forces, essentially, and the Russian, invasion. That's the first element. Now, when Ukrainians push them back and, are close to cutting them off from the border in the summer of 2014, now this is where the regular army steps in openly. Had it not, of course, it had been involved earlier, but then now the numbers are bigger. So you go from I'm pretending it's proxies towards our own involvement, but still attempting to mask it as much as possible, placing the artillery on the Russian side of the border and pretending it's just, shells are coming from God knows where, and it's got nothing to do with us. That they're still called volunteers, those Russian troops that are attacking. You go back to the scenario of the little green man of 2014. And on top of that, you've got foreigners coming in. You put them in front of the cameras and they say, we're here to fight, but we're also here to educate our audiences. That is a beautiful propaganda operation that's kind of going wrong later on, because then you realize that you've attracted the wrong people. You wanted internationalists from the far left, and you get the Nazis from the far right coming in. Yet it's Ukraine that is quite often accused of actually attracting such individuals, which is not true, to be perfectly honest. So, this is a deployable scenario, but it's got many catches and caveats. And I think as it unfolds, at some point, Russia decides to kind of, to take a step back. And you see that when they especially, and I'll stop here, when they especially remove the leadership of the nascent republics, Donetsk and Luhansk, with, their proxies, and they're Russians initially, like, Russians. There is an attempt to Ukrainize this, bring in the genuine locals, so that, again, you could say it's not us, yet at the same time you play up the proxy factor, saying, it's the local people of Donetsk and Luhansk who actually stepped up and picked up their guns, nothing to do with us. And it's always, it's these ebbs and flows, which obviously, when the conflict there's an intensification of the conflict, the ebbs and flows in a way stop. But throughout the earlier years, it kind of goes in these ebbs and flows. If you don't mind me saying this.
Wonderful, thank you. My next question is: and Brian kind of primed us for this, have the use of proxies by Russia in this conflict been effective? And by effective, I generally mean, has it been helpful in them achieving their goals or strategic objectives in some way? If so, why? And if not, what would make them more effective? Ben, if we could start with you and then maybe get everybody else's sentiment as well.
Sure, yeah. So the period that Kasper was just talking about in 2014, 2015, these proxy forces clearly served a domestic political role for the Kremlin, in that they partially sort of obscured the cost of this military intervention, and they provided this deniable fig leaf. And Putin has always appreciated the power of a fig leaf, sort of following the letter of the law in many ways while simultaneously hollowing it out. Now in the current post-February 2022 iteration of the war, neither of those two benefits really seem to be applicable. I mean, obviously, nobody is doubting that Russia is waging a war on Ukraine at this point. And the main purpose that these proxy forces served Russia was one of their overriding problems, which has just been manpower, right? It allowed them to plug the hole when they manifestly did not have enough forces to actually carry out the task. Obviously, as we've seen, that use was also not sustainable, which has now forced them to make this politically costly choice to conduct a mass mobilization. One of the big problems that we've seen emerge through their use of these proxy forces is problems of fragmentation of command and mixed motives. So, I referred earlier to how Wagner forces are advancing around the town of Bakhmut, even as Russian fighters near them are retreating. I've seen some people speculate that this is related to Wagner's desire, or the units in question's desire, to sort of capture a town and appear effective and get the propaganda win and the accolades for that, rather than, say, plugging holes close to them that it might be very important for them to plug. So I guess I'll leave it there. But yeah, this fragmentation of command seems to be one of the major problems that's cropped up.
That's really fascinating. It's not something that I was aware of. Really remarkable, and might tie into a question I have about disruption later on. Casper, do you have something to add?
Yes, I think I'll maybe speak about the unsuccessful usage of proxies, if you don't mind, because we talk a lot about how how kind of integral it is to their DNA, and how successful it's been. But let's look at one which was unsuccessful, and it's kind of very much from my field, because I very much look at the far right. I work at an institute, Center for the Research on far right extremism, essentially. Russians deployed the Kadyrovtsi, the Chechens, to attack Kiev from the north. Initially, at the beginning of the war. At the same time, it's the troops from the Eastern Military District, who look Asian because they are from Asia, essentially, to attack Kiev as well. Now, let's focus on the Chechens, but also, the troops from the Eastern Military District, which are not proxy forces, but, there's a price to be paid. When you use such forces there, quite a lot of your far-right friends in the West, and Russia has lots of far-right friends in the West and in the US and in Western Europe, are absolutely shell-shocked. And believe me, this is my bread and butter, and I watch this every day, and I speak to these individuals, and they're clueless as to what is happening. Why does the white, traditional, orthodox, spiritual, anti-liberal, anti-LGBT leader, how is that possible that person, Putin, is deploying Muslims and Asians who are not like us to fight Ukraine? This is ridiculous. We cannot accept that. So there is a price to be paid for all those TikTok videos of, the Chechens, the Kadyrovtsi out there, that it confuses some of your initial proxies. You use one set of proxies to fight your war, but your political proxies and maybe possible recruits as foreign fighters, and that has been the case from 2014 onwards, they are confused, and they don't switch to Ukraine. I would never say that, but maybe I will not collect money for you, Russia. Maybe I will not go and join you as a fighter or as a propagandist, Russia. That is the price that you sometimes pay for it. And the confusion related to that was profound, and we shouldn't disregard this. And actually is a fantastic weapon for us in terms of information warfare, that the seemingly united package of forces aligned, non-homogeneous forces aligned behind Russia's banner can be broken into smaller constituencies and actually pushed towards arguments with each other over issues like this one. You wouldn't believe the plethora of hatred that was thrown at Russia the moment these guys realized that it's just Asians and Muslims actually attacking Kiev. The prize asset, not somewhere on the eastern and southern front, but the prize asset that was meant to be taken by, well, I guess, blonde Slavs. Well, it didn't work that way, thankfully, for Russia.
And go
Sorry, very quick follow-up to that. It has been interesting to see how the Kadirovtsi have been, when they were initially rolled out, there was sort of a big propaganda to do of like, oh, here come the shock troops. They're going to come and commit unspeakable violence upon the people of Ukraine. And I'm sure plenty of violence has been done. But they've also generally seemed to be relatively ineffective as a fighting force in comparison to a lot of, just the rest of the pro-Russian forces fighting. You see, a lot of times it seems as Casper referred to, they seem very preoccupied with just their own self-image and self-promotion and generating these, videos for TikTok or Instagram.
This discussion is really reminding me what Sarah in the first panel talked about how powerful an overlap of interests can be between state and proxy in the short term. Do you think that's what's going on here with Putin's recruitment of these specific contingents, or do you think their interests can persist in the long term? Their overlapping interests. I apologize. Casper, what do you think?
Yeah, I would say, it depends on how well this war goes for them. Because, there's this saying that even before February 24th, 2022, you could say critical things in Russia if you were connected. But the one area that you couldn't touch was, presence of Ramzan Kadyrov and Chechens, because that would put you in hot water, And I was kind of like, wow, this is years before, 2022. So I'm kind of thinking, depends on how long this whole thing holds. And this is the beauty of it and the nightmare of it, because it's such a non-homogeneous state. And will there be local chieftains? Effectively, we should call them chieftains, maybe not warlords, who would be willing to rock the boat. But I think much more needs to happen if we go down that road. But I think even the fact that we would be discussing it, half a year ago, that was unthinkable. Probably, the discussion then was, will Ukraine hold, stand, etc., etc. And I think it now also reflects something was very wrong with the execution, including of the, related to the proxies by the Russian state in the first place. What looked like an, beauty of many colors, let many flowers bloom, in a sense, type of a strategy now looks like one of the recipes for disaster. Because if you're a military, it's kind of Wehrmacht versus Waffen-SS type of a situation on Eastern Front in the 1940s, that I'm a Wehrmacht commander and I cannot tell Waffen-SS what to do because they're politically connected in Berlin. And here's a similar situation. I'm a Russian general and I cannot boss around a smaller unit of Kadyrovtsi or Wagner because they pick up the phone and they call someone important. I think, the best snapshot of that was the spoof that actually a Russian, YouTube website did with, I think, the son of one of the prominent Moscow, let's say, elite representatives, so to speak. And he was phoned, and then they said, like, look, you're up for mobilization. And he says, do you know who I am? And if you function like that on the front line, well, I guess Colonel would say more about that. If there's a unit sitting next to him that he cannot actually give orders to, even though the officer commanding it is just the captain. Well, that would be interesting. I'd love to hear from a military professional how would that roll on the on that side.
Well, I don't know if I can answer that specifically, but I do appreciate your mention of the dynamic nature of conflicts. So Clausewitz often, is quoted when we talk about lots of things with regards to war, but that everything may be simple, but that doesn't make it easy to accomplish, that there's lots of fog and friction, that a seemingly small thing at a small level can have ripple-sized or outsized impact, and the non-linear nature of war. And so I was going to talk about that as well, and just kind of take that in a slightly different direction. So I think it's important to think about what's in the backdrop here of proxy use calculations and how they may change over time from what pre-conflict or in frozen conflict to during the more heated exchanges that we've seen since February, and then potentially in the future. And it varies by state and in those different types of situations. And certainly we've got a couple experts here that can talk to that better, but more just from a conceptual perspective, I think the risk calculation impacting proxy use affects how if they're utilized, how they're utilized, why they're utilized, when, where, the amount, what level of control you have over them. And those are each of those factors, as Casper was talking about, the dynamic situation that's involved are not static. And so I think we're likely to see continuing evolving aspects on both sides. And certainly there's considerations on the American or the NATO side of what support, what type, how much, what level of, or how many iteration tranches of equipment are we going to provide? Are we going to continue providing the same amount or different? That perhaps different because of ammunition supplies and how much is left, different perhaps because of what will be most effective at that period of time, whether because it's more accurate or because the evolving nature of the warfare means that different equipment would be more effective then. So these are just some of the different factors that are important to consider as we look at what's actually going on with the risk calculation. And I think the bigger factors of mobilization, of tactical nuclear use or whatever, along with proxies, are all considerations that Putin, as advised by his generals, is going to have to be making if things continue not to go well for them. But those factors will be different if, for instance, the Ukrainians do not continue to have the success that they're currently having at the rate they're having. If they cross the Dnieper River and then winter comes, or the water freezes or doesn't, the ground freezes or doesn't freeze, if it isn't like it's been in the past few years of in that area of lesser temperatures, not freezing as much, all these factors affect what are you going to do, how are you reaching a culminating point, what pace and tempo can you keep up for your offensive operations, or can you mount a counterattack, and whether you are better off using proxies or some other form like this reserve call up, or God forbid, nuclear weapons or something, to try to turn the tide if you feel more desperate than others.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I did have a question that I'm particularly interested in. So what, if any, opportunities can exist for disruption of Russian support to proxies in the Ukrainian conflict? Brian, can we actually start with you, and then we'll go back in reverse order?
Sure. I'm sorry. I was distracted a second. Can you say that again?
Yeah, no problem. What, if any, opportunities exist to disrupt Russian support to its proxies in the conflict?
I'd certainly like to hear what Casper and Ben have to say. I think, especially as it relates specifically to proxies, and answering your question directly, I think writ large, I just frame it more in the sense of right now things are not going particularly well externally or internally for Putin. And I think his reserve call up is an example of his risk calculus and his desperation might be too strong of a word, because certainly he has the ability at his disposal to do certain, take actions to correct the advances that the Ukrainian armed forces are experiencing. But yet the tide has definitely swung at this point in time in the Ukrainians' favor. And so he's having to look at, do I support the proxies more? Do I go in different direction? How soon will the reservists actually be ready? And how effective will they be? Will I experience any differences with them? as I'm understanding, it's certainly not the expert on this, but most of them do not have the level of combat experience, and it would take some period of time, from measured in months to maybe a year in more extreme cases, to get them trained up. But even when he does that, what are the material what's the material situation, composition, disposition, and strength of his forces? And do they feel empowered with high morale or not, in order to move forward and execute orders and counter attack and change the tide of battle? And so I think he's got to weigh support to proxies and or support to his conventional forces in the back, with a lot of that in the backdrop of his consideration.
Casper or Ben, anything to add?
Yeah, I'd love to. Thank you for that, Brian. I would say maybe let's put it on its head and actually ask for more proxies on the Russian side, because if that makes it a bigger mess, if that adds up to the emergence of any sort of challengers locally, regionally, to the current setup in Russia. And I think, we shouldn't shy away from these discussions that, we're actually looking for some kind of a political change in that country, be it smaller or larger. Then maybe if the proxies actually help to, cross these wires, and then we shouldn't really disrupt them. Don't get me wrong, of course, fighting Wagner, and then, I'm not saying let's leave them alone and then let's have them, let's allow them to have all sorts of battlefield success. No. But at the same time, maybe this is a way, we're dealing with a country that it's alleged, that says it's European and it borders North Korea. So, there's a lot of variety there, and maybe let all the flowers bloom and let's see what actually happens. There's been so much of, so little internal discussion in the open in Russia throughout the last 2 decades plus. So maybe that's the way of unleashing this, or one of the ways. Then I'm all for it. I'm just provocatively, Nakisa, don't hold it against me, because normally I would say yes, suppress them, etc. But I just wanted to kind of stir up the discussion here.
Two quick non-military ideas. I mentioned at the top that a lot of these contingents seem to be better provisioned than just regular Russian military units. And that seems to be at least in part related to their success at setting up independent fundraising and purchasing networks. And one thing that we've been following pretty closely is their very consistent use of, or request for, cryptocurrency donations from all over the world. Cryptocurrency needs to be cashed out at some point, which typically requires a crypto exchange. Crypto exchanges are potentially susceptible to US or international pressure. So there's a particular pressure point. Another one might be, I think that we still don't know nearly enough as we could or should about the actual command structure of these units. We should learn as much as possible about that and seek to aid ongoing efforts to tie the ample violations of international human rights law and humanitarian law in Ukraine to specific units and specific commanders, so that with the implication that there will eventually, sooner or later, even if it's many years down the road, be some kind of accountability for these atrocities that are being committed in Ukraine. Those are my 2 cents.
Wonderful. I know we just have a couple minutes left, so I was hoping I could get a quick soundbite from each of you about where do you see the role of proxy support going forward in the conflict. A audience member had asked, so what's next? Are we going to see horizon escalation by Russia mobilizing proxies elsewhere? Will this just drag on as attrition or a frozen conflict? But I'd really like to expand that more into getting your sense of what do you see of the use of the future proxy support going forward in the war? Sorry, let's start with Casper.
Yes, thank you, Nakisa. I'll maybe jump in on this element related to the future in relation to the West, because quite often we've heard that those proxies who are actually from the West, or include Westerners, broadly speaking, who are on the Russian side, they might be turned against us in the West. Now, if you look at what Russia is saying and doing about the West, when it's basically saying that it doesn't need us because we've sold out and we're lost to some kind of LGBT cabal, I don't think to what extent, and I did deliberately use the word cabal here. I'm just wondering to what extent are these assets still assets? To be honest, can they be turned into some kind of sabotage / terrorist / political trouble proxies in our land? That is something that fascinates me. And I'd love to, kind of look at that and to see how the guys that I've been following since 2014, who pilgrimaged to Donetsk and Luhansk and Moscow back then, will they be somehow activated? Because they've been pretty quiet since the 24th of February. So this is probably something to watch out for me in the upcoming months in this sense.
Great, Ben. And then Brian.
A little hesitant to prognosticate, but I would not be surprised to see through military necessity some kind of, effort to subordinate proxy forces to a more centralized command structure to address that problem of mixed motives that I mentioned earlier. Another thing I have seen suggested is, if Putin is wary of escalating in the form of, a tactical nuke that people have been talking about, another option he might choose to go in to increase pressure on Ukraine is to scale up efforts at either targeted assassinations. There's been some talk of, maybe there will be some retaliation for, bombing up Daria Dugina, for instance, or destruction of civilian infrastructure. And both of those are, tasks that we should not be surprised to see proxy actors sort of assigned to carry out within Ukraine.
Thank you. Brian?
Sure. Well, I think Casper and Ben have hit on the details much better than I could. What I would offer is that from my perspective, and I know from others across the national security apparatus, that one of the $1 million questions here is, what is China making of all of that? And what will be the implications beyond this war and this region to what the Secretary of Defense often refers to as the pacing challenge China for us, and whether it relates specifically to the Taiwan question or more broadly their aggressive behavior throughout their area in the Western Pacific and so forth. And so I think one way to think about this is what we say oftentimes that what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. Well, I think this is, I'm not a fan of that way of thinking or behaving, but nonetheless, it's out there in the popular culture. And so I think it's catchy and helps us think that the reverse of the Vegas rules are at play here. That what happens in Vegas, or in this case Ukraine, will not stay there. That there will be ramifications, and so those ramifications will differ based upon the perception on the part of the Chinese and others of level of commitment of the U.S. and the West and the broad West, not just geographical West, but the coalition supporting Ukraine here and how that plays out. And so there's a real sense and balance between how much support do we provide now if we're viewing the Ukrainian armed forces as our proxies or not, and because of the implications for our own defense or what we might need later, versus no, it actually matters because the way to assure our allies and partners in other situations across the Pacific and to deter China or North Korea, as we've seen lately, and others, is by making sure that things go the way we want them to in Ukraine. And so that's very much going to matter. And as the national military strategy comes out, an unclassified national defense strategy here over the course of hopefully not too long from now this fall, you might see some elements of dealing with this uncertain world and trying to balance all of those dynamics and making hard choices across those.
Wonderful. I just want to say a quick thank you to all the panelists. I learned so much from speaking with each of you, and I just want to turn the mic back to Andy. Thank you again for letting me moderate.
Ladies and gentlemen, with Nikisa's closing comments, I also wish to thank our second panel for offering their expertise, their insight, and their support to the Irregular Warfare Initiative in making this event happen.
The team at IWI aims to support the community of irregular warfare professionals in a number of ways, and that includes generating the Irregular Warfare podcast, which releases every 2 weeks, written articles by members of the community like you, a non-resident fellows program, and of course events like this to bring together the irregular warfare professional community to talk about important contemporary issues. If you haven't already, please sign up to receive our monthly email newsletter summarizing this content.
A reminder all, this session has been recorded and it will be released on the IWI website and social media channels in coming weeks. Our next webinar event will be on the 10th of November, when IWI will work with NATO's Special Operations Component to explore a number of issues relating to the employment of resistance in Ukraine and its implications from a number of European perspectives. We'll hope you'll be able to join us. Thank you again for joining this conversation, and good evening.